slowly walked nearer. More birds flew above them. Kong moved a little at the noise, but didn't wake up. Jack quickly put out his hand to Anne, and she felt his fingers with hers. Then, suddenly, Kong's eyes opened, and his fingers closed around Anne. He jumped to his feet and roared at Jack. "Run, Jack!" Anne screamed. Kong's great hand came down above Jack's head, but Jack jumped away very quickly. Kong put Anne down and turned to Jack. He roared and ran at him. Jack fell to the ground and moved to the right and to the left. Kong's large foot came down, but Jack was too fast for the gorilla. Suddenly, Anne screamed wildly, and Kong turned to her. Jack ran to a safer place behind a tree, but he could see giant birds around Anne's head. The birds tried to take her off of the rock, but she fought back. Kong ran and roared angrily at the birds. He picked Anne up and fought the birds with his free hand, but now there were too many of them, and he had to put her down. The birds fought hard and were very strong. There were cuts on Kong's large arms, but he didn't stop. He had to save Anne. Jack quickly ran and took Anne's hand. There was only one way out of there. It was almost 2,000 meters to the bottom of the mountain, but they had to try. Anne put her arms around Jack, and he caught a thick vine in his hands. With Anne on his back, he jumped. Hand over hand, he climbed down the vine. Kong roared from above. Jack looked up and saw the gorilla with 2 giant birds on his back. Kong quickly pulled them off and killed them. The other birds flew away. "No, don't go. We have to have a little more time," Jack thought. Jack and Anne were only 100 meters down the vine when Kong began to pull them up. A giant bird came back and flew around them. Jack took one hand off the vine and caught the bird's foot. Then Jack quickly took his other hand off the vine and took the bird's foot. But he and Anne were too heavy, so the bird started to fall. Jack looked down, and below them he saw a fast river. His hands left the bird's feet, and they fell. Anne screamed. Above them, Kong roared. The river carried Jack and Anne away very quickly, but after a minute or two, they came to a quieter, slower place in the river. They swam out and fell on the ground. They were very weak, but they weren't dead. "Jack?" Anne said. "Here I am," he answered. "Did he follow us?" "He will." Anne turned her head and looked at Jack. She was wet, dirty, and very afraid, but he saw a different Anne. "She is really beautiful," he thought, and suddenly he felt better. "Thank you," said Anne. "For what?" he asked her. "You saved me." "Only you," she answered. He wanted to say something, but he couldn't find the right words. He put out his hand and felt her face. She put her hand out to him. Then he moved away from her. Anne didn't understand, so she pulled away too. Before Jack could say anything, Kong roared above them. They quickly jumped up and looked up at the mountain top. Kong's heavy feet came nearer, so they ran for their lives. Anne felt very bad about Kong now. "I'm his only family, and he saved me," she thought. "But I want to go home." She was afraid and felt sad for Kong at the same time. Anne and Jack ran very fast through the jungle, and the trees and vines cut their faces and arms. Suddenly, in front of them, they saw the wall. There was the rock bed at the bottom of the great wall. Kong roared and roared, louder and angrier. Between the wall and the rock bed was the ravine. There was the bridge. Anne remembered it well. But it was up, and they couldn't go across. "Put down the bridge!" Jack screamed. "Help us, please!" Anne cried. She turned. Kong broke down the last trees between them and him. Anne looked up at the wall and said, "They left. They're not here." "Carl!" Jack shouted. The morning sky was a beautiful color. Behind the wall, Carl heard his friends, but he did nothing. Preston, Jimmy, Bruce, and Englehorn stood behind him. "Put the bridge down!" Preston said angrily to his boss. "Wait," Carl answered. One of the sailors had a big knife in his hand. He was ready, but he waited for Carl's word. Carl said nothing. Preston said angrily, "No! You're not the boss now!" He quickly took the knife from the sailor and cut the rope. It flew back at him and cut his face badly. The bridge went down, and Carl saw Kong's eyes behind Jack. With the bridge down, Jack and Anne ran across it. At the same time, Kong jumped over the ravine. Jack and Anne ran through the open door in the wall. Then they stopped and looked back. Two sailors had chains in their hands and were ready. Preston was near, and he, too, was ready. He tried to clean his cut face with his shirt. The shirt turned dark red, but he didn't have time for that now. Englehorn was ready, too, with a large bottle of chloroform. "What are you doing?" Anne asked Englehorn. Kong roared angrily and tried to break down the wall. He found a small, weak place and kicked it hard many times. "Get ready!" Englehorn shouted. Kong angrily broke through the wall and ran. But then he stopped and looked around. His eyes found Anne. Then Kong put out his hand to her. "Do it now, Engelhorn!" shouted Carl. Engelhorn turned to his men and said, "Now!" The sailors jumped up and ran at Kong with their ropes and chains. Jack watched angrily, but what could he do? "No!" Anne cried. "Carl, are you crazy?" Jack shouted. Some sailors on the wall were ready too. When Engelhorn shouted to them, they threw a large bag down on top of Kong. Then they quickly put chains on him. He was on the ground, but he didn't stop fighting. "Chloroform!" Carl shouted to Engelhorn. Anne cried, "No, don't do this!" She started to run to Kong, but Jack took her arm. "Anne, he'll kill you," Jack said. "No, he won't," she cried. She had to help him. When Kong tried to get up, Engelhorn threw the bottle of chloroform into Kong's mouth and eyes. Then the men pushed giant rocks off the top of the wall onto Kong's head. Anne ran from Jack's arms to Engelhorn and caught his arm. "Stop it! You're going to kill him!" she shouted. Engelhorn looked at Jack and shouted, "Take her away!" Jack wanted to save Kong, but first he had to save Anne. He pulled her to the beach, away from the men, away from the gorilla. Suddenly, Kong stood up and roared loudly. "We can't stop him!" shouted one of the sailors. "Kill it!" shouted Engelhorn. "Shoot it!" "No! I want him, but not dead!" Carl shouted. But Kong was free of the ropes and chains and ran for Anne. "Get in the boat," Jack said to Anne. Sailors from the ship were there in the two small boats. "No, he wants me. I can stop this," Anne shouted. Kong roared angrily from above, and Jack pushed Anne into the boat. "Take her," he said. "Take your hands off me. I'm going to him," she shouted angrily. Engelhorn jumped into the little boat with Anne and Bruce. "Let's get away from here now," he shouted. Jack and Jimmy got into a second boat with Carl and Preston. Jimmy wanted to shoot Kong, but Carl stopped him. Anne watched Carl's hands when he opened another bottle of chloroform. She felt very sad and angry, but she couldn't do anything. Jimmy shot Kong in the leg. Now Kong was angrier and more dangerous. He quickly ran to the boat and hit it hard. Carl fell into the water with the bottle of chloroform in his hand. Kong picked the boat up out of the water. Sailors screamed and fell into the ocean. Kong picked up the boat and threw it onto some rocks. Jack came up from under the water with Jimmy under one arm. Kong looked at Anne. "Go back!" she shouted to him. Engelhorn shot Kong in the leg, and he fell. Anne cried and tried to get out of the boat. One of the men stopped her. Carl was on some rocks, and Kong was near him now. Carl opened the bottle of chloroform and threw it in Kong's face. Kong's eyes closed, and he put out his hand to Anne. Then he fell onto his back, asleep. Anne felt cold. She thought, Kong's life is changing here on this beach. It'll never be the same again. But Carl stood next to Kong and smiled happily. He shouted, "The world will see him! We're rich! His name will be in lights on Broadway! Kong, the giant gorilla from a past world!" Chapter 6. Kong in New York City. Suddenly, Kong broke free from his chains. People started to understand. Nobody was safe. They screamed. In New York's Times Square, Preston stood across the street from the Alhambra Theater and looked up at the lights above its doors. "Kong, giant from a past world," he read. People got out of taxis, and a long line of people waited outside the theater in the snow. There were no more tickets, but they wanted to go in. Preston felt unhappy about Carl's money-making plan for Kong, and he didn't really want to see it. But after tonight, he could leave Carl and forget about Skull Island. He wanted to sleep well again at night. Anne sat in her little dressing room in the back of the theater. She was almost ready. She didn't feel happy in the theater now, but she had to work. After those 2 days on Skull Island, everything about her life felt strange. Preston sat down inside the theater and looked around for Carl. He saw him up front with the bankers. They looked happy. But when Carl saw Preston, he quickly turned his head. Then he smiled for a newspaper man with a camera. Jack Driscoll was in another theater on 42nd Street. He sat and watched the actors in his new story. But he couldn't stop thinking about Anne. Kong was in the Alhambra Theater that same night. He knew that. "Is Anne there too?" he thought. He hoped. He left the theater and walked quickly to Times Square. He had to see her. Carl was as excited as the people in the theater. "Thank you! Thank you!" he said to them. "I'm going to tell you a very strange story. On a dangerous trip to Skull Island with my actors, 17 people lost their lives. They died when they tried to save a young woman from a giant animal. You'll see this giant here tonight. He saw a beautiful young woman from New York, and he loved her. You all know stories about an ugly animal's love for a beautiful woman." In her dressing room, Anne looked beautiful in her long white dress. Her yellow hair shone under the lights.